Hi, I'm Tom Ising. While they're setting it up, I have to answer an earnest question which has been asked. My father, when he was born, and when I was born, was known as Ernst Ising. When he got to the United States, here he is as Ernst Ising, and my mother is Hanna Ising, Ernst Ising. When he's in Peoria putting his full boat together, he and my mother are known as Ernest and Jane Ising. Since this happened in 1947, around 1947, when we came in the United States, it's a 50-50 deal. Half the time he was Ernst Ising, and half the time he was Ernest Ising. So you decide for yourself which one you want.
Here's a mic for you. You just gotta click that on your. Do it right there.
Okay. Wait a minute. Well, I should stand over here and
No, you
find.
got it. You're fine. It's
Okay.
in your pocket.
It all started with Philip Freudenberg. In 1833, he was born. He is the brother of my great-grandmother. Philip made it all happen. He was born in poverty, barely made any money. At age 15, he went to buy hemp for his uncle. And in 1858, he found Benny Lowenstein, another relative, who had a store. 2 years later, he looks like this, not a guy buying hemp. In a couple years later, he married a niece of Benny, Johanna Lowenstein. He opened his own shop. A year later, he brought Leo Hirsch, a good friend, together, and his two younger sisters. Johanna, he married to Leo, and Sophia, he married to Emanuel Löwe. They're my great-grandparents. Whoops, yeah, okay. Philip went on to buy Gershon's in Berlin and rebuilt it into this store. He had 1,200 employees, and his son built a 32-room home with the largest Van Gogh collection. The store was confiscated by Hitler and destroyed. Here's a book I found on him originally, stuck to one of my parents' books. Here he is getting married, and here he is older. These are my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my father's grandparents. Sophia and Emmanuel, they opened, with Philip's help, they opened Eleuve, a department store, which you see in the picture there from 1910. My grandmother says they had a table for 40 people, 40 workers, so you can tell the kind of organization it was. They had 5 children. 2 of them died before the war, and Siegfried took over the store, and his wife Hedwig and their son Eric were murdered at Theresienstadt. Their sister Lotte was born. This is a 1910 picture. They were living at 18 Goethestrasse in Bochum. Gustav ran a very fashionable clothing store. These are the kind of people who signed the guest book and stayed overnight. This is the house on 18 Goethestrasse. It was bombed during the war. It had a 2-story stained glass window from Torn Pricker, which ended up in shattered glass. Here's a picture of Lotte and Ernest as a young couple. My father was interested in acting, and Heinz was his best friend, and Willy Busch, who was an actor, would come over and give him elocution lessons. And we visited Heinz in Wuppertal. He ran a theater there. That's a 1973 picture. Here's a whole bunch of pictures of my father at a young age. hiking with his grandmother in the Alps, which he did frequently, taking pictures. Obviously, at 24, he did his thesis. William Lenz was his advisor. His fellow student was Wolfgang Pauli. What did I do? Oh, okay, I pushed the wrong button. Thank you. Also in 24, his sister Lotte got married to Hermann Busch, Adolf and Friedel Busch, the Busch family on that side. Here's my grandfather, my father, and my grandmother Tekla. The Busch Quartet was probably the most famous quartet in Europe at the time. Here's Adolf and Hermann, and here's the four brothers. Fritz couldn't make the wedding because he was the conductor of the Dresden Opera and Symphony. Adolf, Hermann, and Adolf's son-in-law, Rudolf Zirkin, founded the Marlborough Music School. Here's some pictures of my father. After he graduated, he worked for GE in Berlin. Hiking with the Pacifist Student Organization, he met my mother, who had just finished her PhD in economics and was working for a professor. In December 23, 1930, they got married. Here's a quick picture. This is Hans. This is my mother as a young lady. This is my mother and her mother and the mother's four sisters. They all had no children and doted on Hannah until she married my father. This is my mother's first visit to my grandparents' house. She was totally impressed by the place, the original paintings, the ceilings, everything. After graduation, after they got married, my father had a degree in teaching, and they went to Strasbourg outside of Berlin. And here he is sitting with my mother and both of their mothers. In March of '33, he got canned by Adolf. He spent a year looking for a place to work, and he came to the Jüdisches Landschulheim in Kaput, which is just outside of Potsdam. And here he is teaching. There's the main building. It's a museum right now. Here he is sitting in his studio, in his office at work. They had one of the houses they rented from the Jewish families who had left, and it was on the Havel River, and sometimes they would try to sit there and have breakfast. That's Einstein's house that was next door. Einstein had obviously left and rented it to them, to the school. He was the head of the school on Kristallnacht when the school was destroyed. And one of the girls said, he led us through the woods just like in The Sound of Music, because they took all the kids out of there safely. He was interrogated at the beginning of January. He said he was going to the United States and let him go. In March, they arrived in Mersch, Luxembourg at the Hotel Sept Chateau. It's still around today. It has a slightly different name. And because of Danny Heinemann and the Busch Quartet. Danny was the head of GE in Belgium, and he talked the Luxembourg government into letting about 100 Jewish families come into Luxembourg and occupy the empty hotels, and he would pay room and board. And so we stayed at this, my parents stayed at this hotel, and they brought me there when I was born. I was born on September 9th, 1939. The question I have is, I am the second Ising model? Anyway, here's some pictures of life in Luxembourg. It was pretty good. The Germans had simply marched through, set up the government in Luxembourg, and went on to fight the war someplace else. So there was no war. On May 10th, 1940, my father's 40th birthday present was the German army walking through, changing the government. And so my father was mainly working farm work, whatever he could find to pay for it, because Danny Heinemann wasn't there to pay any more money. For about 10 months, when the Jewish kids were kicked out of school in Luxembourg, they opened a couple of apartments, and my father was in charge of teaching the kids. There had about 3 teachers. The Germans took over this Chateau Cinquefontaine or Finfonen, and used it as their deportation place for the German Jews. The railroad runs along there. There was a rail siding where they could bring up boxcars. And my father worked there for a couple of months. I was there for 2 weeks or something, I don't remember. Then he went back to farming. And then after that, they took him and 35 other Jewish men of mixed marriages and had them pick up the railroad ties at the Maginot Line and ship them to the Eastern Front. On September 10th, the day after my 5th birthday, the American soldiers arrived and things changed. The Americans needed a translator, and all the girls needed to speak English, so he had a job. The Battle of the Bulge came within 10 miles. The paperwork to America had to start again. My grandparents had made it to Switzerland, and Lotte and Herman had made it to New York. But in April of '46, we spent a month in Switzerland. And here's the Aura Gorge. Here we are near Titlis. Here we are having lunch someplace. And here's the whole family. My father, me, my grandmother, my mother, Gustav, and Lotte. I think that's the only time I ever met my grandfather. And here's the 3 of us. And just to show you this is my grandmother in Greece. She was a real, oh, I did that again. Hold on. Okay, I know how to do this now. In April of '47, we boarded the freighter Lipscomb Lycus for Hoboken, New Jersey. Arriving on April 12th, Lotte met us and took us to our apartment. They were on a trip to Europe, so we had the apartment for a couple of months. And my father went to a physics convention. At the convention, somebody said, "Are you the Ising of the Ising model?" My father was a little confused because he had no idea. He had been out of it for so long. Minot State Teachers College offered some employment. They wanted to know if he could speak English well enough to teach, and he had to learn how to teach in an American college and in English. The next year, we moved to Bradley, and normalcy and everything else went fine. Here we are in '48 in Glacier National Park, in '49 in Rocky Mountain National Park. Here's a picture later on. My father in the yearbook at Bradley Yearbook, a 50th anniversary article about his PhD. He and my mother sponsored quite a few Ising scholars, and a newspaper article had them ice skating. And this is me, Lotte, and my father on a cruise through the Panama Canal, along with, obviously, Carol and my mother. So he taught at Bradley for about 30 years. Here's some interesting pictures. This is the picture they used in my father's obituary. And this is something that a guy named El Greco made of that. It's not the original El Greco. Hit a wrong button all the time. There we go. This is the stack of roses, flowers that Soren sent to my mother, and she's sitting there enjoying it in '09. In '09 also, they dedicated a street to my father in Mersch. Here we are receiving the sign. Germaine is the head of literature in Luxembourg, and her husband. And here's my mother enjoying the sign. And this is how it looks today from Google Map. And there's a nice playground right there where we're standing. My mother did. She died on her 110th birthday. And Google says, barely a supercentenarian. And these are my favorite pictures of my parents. And that's it.